speaker. But first, I do want to thank the Digital Synergies Arts Signature Area for co-sponsoring this event, and especially for helping us to promote it. I should also mention that the coffee delivery is late, so keep an eye on Lenine. She'll give some sort of signal when it's here if you want to sneak out and fill your cup. Apologies for the delay. Trevor Blank is Associate Professor of English and Communication at the State University of New York in Potsdam. In the last decade or so, he has authored or edited 9 scholarly books. That's right, I said 9, N-I-N-E, 9 scholarly books, and numerous articles on various aspects of digital culture, humor, and urban legends. Many of them have been recognized as pioneering works in the study of folklore as it relates to the digital humanities and media studies. I won't take the time to comment on every item on the CV, but it's worth highlighting a few of his contributions, including the 2009 edited collection Folklore and the Internet, which was one of the very first works to consider those two subjects together. Of his 2013 book, The Last Laugh, Folk Humor, Celebrity Culture, and Mass-Mediated Disasters in the Digital Age, one reviewer wrote that it places him at the vanguard of vernacular media studies. And most recently, he co-edited the 2018 volume, Slender Man is Coming, Creepypasta and Contemporary Legends on the Internet, which is a fascinating look at digital folklore as it relates to horror, urban legends, and monsters. And if you don't know what Slender Man is, maybe take a moment now to Google it instead of waiting for when it's dark outside and you're alone. Finally, I'll mention that 2 of his many articles won prizes in consecutive years from the American Folklore Society in 2009 and 2010. In short, Dr. Blank is among the most accomplished and influential scholars of folklore in the digital age, and we're very pleased to welcome him to the University of Alberta. His talk today is Screening Folklore, the Imprint of Film, Television, and New Media in Contemporary Vernacular Expression. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Trevor Blank.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you all so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be out this way. I usually don't get out far west. I do get to get up to Canada every now and again. I live in northern New York, only about 10 miles from the Canadian border, so I get to sample what it's like to be Canadian every now and again, going up to Quebec and Ontario. I live just like kind of in this weird triangle just below Ottawa and Montreal, so they're about equidistant from me. So I occasionally get to check out there, but this is my first time in Alberta, so it's great to be here. And I hear this is excellent weather, which is awesome to hear as well, because I come from a place, I heard that you get like sunshine 270 days out of the year, which is amazing because where I live in New York, we have clouds 80% of the year. So so you get the cool weather, but also the bright sun. It's amazing. So I've been really enjoying taking it into town and being here with you today. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. And I appreciate that wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to all of those wonderful things said about me. Well, basically what I do is I study folklore from a digital culture perspective. I look at how folklore is influenced by and influences mass media in film and television and pop culture. And if you recognize this image here on the screen, there's a very good chance that you are a consumer of at least the internet and most likely television and pop culture as well. And this kind of is a sort of a funny meme probably going around. You probably have seen it in some form or another at some point. And you know, without any kind of content or anything like that, it just looks like kind of a funny image. But if you delve deeper into it, there's these whole complex backstories that you know, imbue meaning into these images that when they're taken into new contexts for new expressive purposes, they go on to mean something completely different. And that's kind of what's interested in me, is how people have taken these things that are supposed to be institutional or supposed to be authoritative or supposed to be official parts of culture and kind of reappropriated them in folkloric ways. And part of this has been influenced through some of my own experience in studying this subject, some of the obstacles that I encountered when I first started getting into this subject matter that kind of have gotten me to where I am today. And from what I understand, your program is one of these rare intersections where you get to bring in folklore and mass media and culture studies all together in kind of one place. And so what I wanted to kind of do today was kind of talk about some of my own work and how a lot of what I do encompasses that. Because on the surface, at least if you're a folklore purist, you may not see the connections necessarily between those different fields, but they're actually quite strong and really important and really revelatory. And one of the things that I also want to kind of preemptively say is that a lot of the examples that I'm going to show you today, I'm going to try to provide some historical context to show you kind of how we got to where we are today and some of the technologically mediated folklore that existed before memes and other forms of digital expression kind of became popular. I want to underscore that a lot of what we see is fun, and it's funny, it's enjoyable to see. But also along with that, we should also realize that that doesn't mean that it's not serious or doesn't have something of value to tell us about culture. The psychologist Brian Sutton Smith, also a folklorist, had this concept that I really liked a lot, known as the triviality barrier. This idea that if something is not seen as serious, it's not therefore taken seriously, particularly by scholars. And I always found that to be a very wrong-headed approach, to look at something and just dismiss it because it's fun or goofy or whatnot. Because these kind of expressive behaviors and these things that pop up really tell us a lot more once we actually start to break them down and try to contextualize them. And sometimes we can't always get all of those answers because things are happening so fast. But nevertheless, if we try to take the time to figure out these ways that these things are being used in folkloric ways, we can see these relevancies that are all around us all the time, particularly in the Western world where media consumption is such a big part of how we stay connected to other people. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my personal journey towards this particular subject and how I started making some of those connections myself and kind of how I ended up becoming this guy who started doing this stuff that hadn't been published before in folklore stuff, which I should also underscore happened in 2009. So 2009 for pioneering work on internet culture is a bit late to the game, and I'm going to address that a little bit as well too. But first I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Maryland, near Washington, D.C. in the United States. And my father was a computer scientist, computer programmer, worked for General Electric and then later Geico, working on their intranet and kind of the systems that they used to provide the stuff for everybody else. So I was surrounded by computers all growing up. The first one that I can remember a lot was the Commodore Amiga, which if you don't know what that is, do yourself a favor and check out what that is, because one of the cool things about going back in the past and learning and looking at all this stuff that was like so mind-blowing at the time is how simple it looks now. And it's kind of cool to see how we've come from this spot. And actually looking back also helps give me some perspective on why so many people were skeptical at first about some of the things that I was trying to be like, no, this is important, this is worthy of our time. So this is actually an Amiga computer I found it online. So I mean, it looks amazing, right? But it really was a special thing to even as a kid, being 3-4 years old, starting to acquire language and stuff like that, to be able to use games and different technologies to create art and stuff like that. It's stuff that we can do on our phones nowadays, but back then was a much more laborious process and not as common. And it was something that I didn't really realize until I was a little bit older, that it was kind of unusual for kids my age to be so immersed in computers. And it was mostly because my dad was in the business. And so that's how I got interested in the subject at first. So I've also always been kind of a bit of a talker and a storyteller. You can probably already tell that about me in just this quick little introduction to myself. And so eventually that led me to be interested in different kind of cultures, particularly how stories were made. Urban legends was something that really interested me a lot, because growing up where I did, you heard all these cool ghost stories and all these haunted places and these rituals that were involved with showing up at midnight and listening for certain sounds and having to do things in a certain order. And there just seemed to be something deeper to it that I wanted to understand, because I've always liked history, I've always liked culture, and I didn't really realize that folklore was kind of the informal traditional culture that we hadn't fully put down as this is exactly what things are and what they do, as I've been told so much in the history field. So it seemed much more interesting to me as someone who grew up in computers and grew up especially on pop culture. I was raised on television. I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. I have tremendous nostalgia for that, and I think a lot of people do too, which is part of the reason why even today so much of digital expression really does kind of pull on those nostalgia strings in some ways, to kind of entice people to want to spread. But I eventually found myself at Indiana University studying folklore for my master's degree after deciding that I wanted to not become a public school teacher and instead quit this job that I was offered right after finishing my undergraduate and going to study folklore, which my parents were not particularly happy about because I had this public school teaching job lined up, and they were like, you want to go to graduate school, okay, but for folklore, what can you do with a folklore degree? I'm sure you, any of you who study folklore have encountered this at one point or another, that, huh, really? What are you going to do with that? How are you going to be paying the bills? And I didn't have a great answer for that right away. I just knew that I found that when I was teaching in the public schools, I wasn't getting the enjoyment or satisfaction that I thought I would out of teaching. And part of that, I realized, was because I could only teach certain things and I had to teach them a certain way because that's what happens when you're teaching in public school. So I wanted to have the freedom to be able to challenge myself to explore things that I found interesting and help other people see why they were interesting as well. And so I had this kind of interesting moment happen to me in 2009, June of 2009, which is what made me decide, okay, digital culture, digital studies, this is what I'm going to do. And it was June 25th, and I was teaching a little class at a community college just outside of Indiana University, and it was only like 12 or 13 students, and somebody's phone vibrated, which in my classroom was a general no-no. You're not supposed to have your phone out or whatever. And so I just kind of gave them the teacher glare, and they put their phone away. But then I heard the phone vibrate again about 30 seconds later, and I was like, gosh, what's going on here? But this time the student pulled his phone out, was looking at it, and I kind of pausing for a second, like, really? And he goes, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt class or anything, but Michael Jackson's dead. And I was like, oh, that's strange, that's a bummer. And then almost before I could finish that sentence, somebody else on the other side of the classroom, their phone started buzzing. And then about 30, 40 seconds later, someone else's phone in the class started to buzz. And over the next 10 minutes or so, out of those 13 students, 10 of the students had their phones go off, someone telling them that Michael Jackson had died. And so I was witnessing in real time how fast information could spread, even in this small, isolated context of a community college class in an evening, far removed from Michael Jackson and his impact. But then, interestingly enough, immediately after that, almost a couple breaths later, somebody started making a joke about, whether people will be moonwalking past his grave as an homage to him once he's put in the ground. And then, of course, it kind of devolved quickly into much more graphic and unflattering kind of jokes thereafter. And I saw this as kind of an interesting moment because it was telling us a great deal about how fast this information changes, but also what people do with that information to kind of process it. And that's kind of where my interest was how are people taking this in and processing it? And sometimes processing it doesn't mean just thinking about it. Sometimes processing it is sharing it. It is just giving it to other people or telling somebody else what you know as part of wrapping your head around what happened. And so it didn't take very long before I found people starting to make jokes online as well and collecting a whole bunch of different things. But one of the things that I found interesting about a lot of the jokes that I was collecting online is they required a certain amount of information that you had to know in order for you to be able to appreciate the joke or want to have the influence to spread it. And some of the things that I was noticing that were kind of imparted in a lot of that stuff was references to pop culture, references to stuff that was going on directly in the news, references to the stuff that had been happening in the news, and it was all being incorporated into these jokes. So if you look at this image, for example, and get the joke, well, then you are the proper student of pop culture that this particular joke was trying to target. So, and if you don't get the joke, then that's okay too. It just goes to kind of show you what the audience was for this particular form of digital culture. So, and just in case you don't, there is a movie franchise of Aliens and Predator, and there was even a time where they got those two together, Alien versus Predator, and this is, of course, a joke playing off of the multiple allegations of child sexual abuse that Michael Jackson encountered throughout his professional career. So this particular image of Alien versus Predator is supposed to be playing off of all that complicated backstory and just kind of putting all of that baggage into one clip, one succinct little image. So in and of itself, the image doesn't necessarily seem to be particularly powerful, but this is actually very, very layered social commentary being shared here. It shows a great deal of information about what the kind of people were watching, what kind of things stuck with them, as well as the typical kind of things that we often find in folklore, such as making wordplay out of humor, or finding different kind of ways to kind of analogize things that we already understand. But I was in graduate school at the time, and I very quickly was met with very strong resistance and told that I can't study this. And the reason for that was not for the reason you might think. It wasn't because it was obscene material. There's plenty of that in folklore. Folklore is not always pretty. And any of you who study folklore know that it's not always just sunshine and flowers and fairy tales. It can sometimes be quite dark and brooding and upsetting even. And that always very much interested me, because whenever I've seen people get uncomfortable or not want to talk about stuff, that's when I start having the most questions, where I'm like, well, why? What is it about it that makes this difficult to talk about? And I was interested in how humor kind of helps open that back up for people, to be able to get into some of these subject matters that are very hard to talk about. And so like something like sexual abuse, one of the most awful things that can happen to a person. It's not something that you want to have in casual conversation with somebody, but if you find a way to put that in a humorous package, all of a sudden you're able to have conversations about things that before were restricted and all of a sudden have been open to you. And so how those kind of dynamics played out were interesting to me, but that wasn't the reason why I couldn't study this. No, the reason I was told, and this was in 2006, 2007 when I was working on my master's degree, is because folklore on the internet is not authentic. It's not real. There is no field on the internet for you to do field work, and therefore it is not a legitimate source of inquiry. And I was crushed by this because I thought, as somebody who'd grown up around this kind of stuff as it was starting to take shape, that it was very much there. I had had folklore defined to me about what I was supposed to include in that particular definition, and I felt rejected, and in fact I was rejected. This is kind of not that I'm super bitter or anything, a little, but I wasn't allowed to matriculate into the PhD program in folklore because I was told what I wanted to study was not actual folklore, and that maybe I should consider a career in studying history. Well, that sucked, and I was not about to just accept that. And so in 2007, really, at that point, yes, bitterness, that was sort of in there. But also this motivation that they were just wrong. Just flat wrong about it, and that it was not right for me, who really felt that I was seeing very obvious forms of folkloric expression online. To be denied that was something I couldn't reconcile that. And then when I was not given the choice to probe that further through graduate studies there, I knew I had to go somewhere else. Well, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do at first, so I spent time kind of gathering my thoughts. And one of the things I did is in 2007, I put out a call for papers. Trying to find people who wanted to talk about this, who wanted to say, yes, this is legitimate, yes, this is something that we should study, yes, this does matter. And that's where folklore on the internet came around. And that came out in 2009, and I did something smart about that I really am glad I did, which was I had the foresight to make sure that I got established folklore scholars to write for it. Because no one knew who I was in 2007, and apparently the people who did know me at IU thought what I was doing had no business being in the field. And so my hope was just that with folklore on the internet, I could at least just make my point, which was that this does matter, there are people who study this, and maybe we should kind of get involved with this because it's almost the end of the first decade of the 21st century, and folklorists really haven't done a whole lot of work with this. It's not to say that it hadn't been touched at all. There was some folklore scholarship that had been touching on this sort of stuff, on technology and whatnot, but it wasn't embraced as like a major part of the field in a lot of ways. And so part of what I wanted to spend the early part of my career, and what I have been doing, has been like trying to be a cheerleader for this subject matter. It's part of the reason why I have found myself, in particular, going towards edited collections, because I found that in my own personal work, I I'm great at talking to people about stuff that interests them. And with an edited project, you kind of get those people in kind of a condensed environment where they all kind of get to say their piece in an interesting way. And if the idea is trying to open people's minds and get them to think about different perspectives, well, that was a great canvas to sort of introduce them to this kind of work. So, to kind of illustrate my point, what I wanted to kind of do was kind of take a minute to kind of backtrack a little and kind of show you some of the stuff that I was seeing and the stuff that I've subsequently collected as part of this case that I've been trying to build for the last 10 or 15 years. And it's funny because now it doesn't seem particularly controversial anymore, because I think more people have come around to the idea that digital expression is relevant and does matter, and there is cool stuff and worthy stuff to check out. But there were some stuff going on before 2009, before Folklore and the internet, that was showing very much the case that media was influencing folklore, and that technology was not something that was to be necessarily feared in folklore, because the tradition within the field has often been to prize face-to-face communication and to present orality as being kind of the end-all be-all of authenticity. And for a long time that worked, but we've had other things come in, and it's important to understand that maybe this pure definition of folklore of unmitigated oral communication could have taken place at some point, but now when people use communication technologies all the time, from the most mundane aspects of their life to the most complicated communication forms out there, there really is something there that I felt needed to be broken down a bit further. And so I'm glad to say that I wasn't the only scholar who noticed this. And one of the ones that really influenced me a lot was, of course, Alan Dundies, who has influenced tremendous generations of folklorists. But there was a series of books that he started putting out with Carl Pachter, starting in 1975 with Urban Folklore from the Paperwork Empire. And one of the things that I remember reading that, and what it was a lot of humor and like jokes and anecdotes and drawings that had been photocopied and circulated kind of anonymously through photocopiers or through fax machines. Didn't know who the persons were who created the images, only that they oftentimes had some kind of snarky element to them. And they ended up doing a series of books over the next 20 years, kind of building off of this. Dundies famously said, the technology isn't stamping out folklore. And I thought, and that was a quote from 1980 that I remember reading and really holding on to. That if Alan Dundies is saying this, then surely that most people will have to listen that there's some weight there behind that. So what I've done in this slide, and kind of what I've done in some of my research, is kind of try to figure out where it kind of comes from. And oftentimes when I talk about Xerox lore or photocopy lore or fax lore, this primary example, I feel, really speaks to where we get memes today, and or more accurately, image macros, but most people kind of colloquially refer to them as memes. As a folklorist, I'm interested in tradition, and that doesn't always necessarily mean long periods of time or history necessarily, but what I'm interested in is patterns of expression. One of the old telltale signs of something being folklore is the notion of repetition and variation, the idea that that forms can repeat in recognizable ways, but they evolve as they meet new contexts and new players, new situations, and things like that. So if you look at just the aesthetic structure of these popularly circulating examples from the, I believe, early 80s, it's not that far off from what you would see in a lot of image macros and memes. An image in the center, text largely at the top, largely at the bottom, and there's usually some kind of humorous effect that's supposed to be incorporated into that. Now, fax lore and Xerox lore was utilized differently. One of the things that was often most collected about the Xerox lore than the examples that I'm showing you here was they were collected from workplaces, and a lot of times even in white-collar work environments. I believe this example on the left, if I'm not mistaken, was taken from, this is from Dundies' collection, I believe was taken from a secretary who had it on like a bulletin board behind her desk. And you know, again, going back to what I was speaking about momentarily a little while ago about how humor opens up abilities to talk about or think about things that we might not otherwise want to address openly and in the present. Well, I think this is an example of that kind of playing off of that as well. Not to mention that there's a whole bunch of different constraints for a woman in a white-collar work environment in the 1980s. A lot more restrictive environment by today's standard compared to today's standards. That being able to joke about something like the female body or about PMS or something that might make a male in an authority position uncomfortable, all the more appealing, especially because you don't know who wrote it. It's just something that's kind of there in the background for expressive purposes. But as time went along, this became more targeted, more on point, more ascertainable in terms of kind of saying different things. Now, there were some that were kind of popularly shared, and then there's some that are kind of more regional. This example here on the right, you might not know or fully follow it unless you're more familiar with American culture, but I don't know what the Canadian equivalent of this would be. Maybe Newfoundland, because I've been there before and they don't like jokes about them. But like West Virginia is this place in the United States that's often kind of relegated as like the punchline for jokes is like being like backwards or rural or something like that. So Kawasaki being a maker of motorcycles and off-road vehicles and things like that, well, calling this a West Virginia motorcycle is obviously not to be kind to somebody from West Virginia. I can remember, as I study children's folklore as well, and I think part of that is because oftentimes when I study children's folklore, I'm reminded of stuff that I found hilarious when I was a kid, just in different forms, and that's part of what's interesting about it to me. But I'll never forget this joke someone told me about West Virginia. Well, I already kind of ruined the punchline by telling you that it's about West Virginia. And I remember the second grade, Sean DiGiacomo, that was his name, comes up to me and goes, "Hey, where was the toothbrush invented?" I said, "Where?" He said, "West Virginia, because everywhere else would have been called a teeth brush." So it kind of gives you an idea of kind of how even kids have been kind of formulated this idea about what this was. So even in something like this, we are seeing values embedded in there, things that are cultural stereotypes that are being perpetuated, for better or for worse. And you know, I grew up in Maryland, which is one state away from West Virginia, and I spent a lot of my childhood going there with camping and sports and things like that. And and kids from there had kind of a good sense of humor about it, I thought, in my experience. Or I don't know if it was just kind of a way of keeping people at arm's length. They were really hurting inside because it really deeply wounded them. But this was the kind of humor that was indicative of that particular region. It was making fun of being from West Virginia was almost as West Virginian as being from there in a lot of ways. And so this technology, and technology being utilized for humorous purposes, is something that very clearly was happening before the internet. The internet did something different though. It made it so that things that were regional or local no longer were stuck in just their regional or local context. They became global and became accessible to large groups of people beyond that. And so, for example, there was a partial nuclear core meltdown at the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility in 1979, where it looked for a few days there might be a serious nuclear waste disaster in the United States that could potentially wipe out Pennsylvania, possibly Washington, D.C., New York. Very serious. And so a lot of the humor that was collected around that period is only from that area that was most under direct threat from being irradiated or in some kind of medical harm. So they were the ones who were telling the jokes like, what's the 5-day forecast for Harrisburg? 3 days. Things like that, meant to play off of regional aspects. Hershey, Pennsylvania, where the Hershey factory is, not too far from where 3 Mile Island was. So again, you see jokes incorporating things about melting in your mouth, not in your hand, like different kind of things. But again, if you pause for a second, you realize that these jokes are bringing in elements of pop culture in order to make themselves relevant. And this was starting to happen a great deal. In the 1980s, one of the first disasters covered very extensively by folklorists was the Challenger disaster. There's a bunch of really great articles written by folklorists about how people responded to the Challenger disaster. But one of the threads that you see in a lot of those jokes is people mentioning 7-Up or Pepsi or different kind of products, consumable products, and incorporating them into the jokes. So in order for you to be able to get the jokes or to fully appreciate them, you have to kind of know the commercials that they're referencing. So there's a lot of, and similarly, not shortly thereafter, there was a live televised suicide of a Pennsylvania politician, Bud Dwyer, and all these wordplay jokes started popping up about needing a bud, or things like that, that were playing off of things that were going on in real time and using technology to express themselves. I thought was really interesting. But when we get more into the computer age, when we get more towards the 1990s, we have the Web 1.0 era, where we start to move away from things being isolated to just Xerox machines and fax machines, but of this whole network of computers that can send information very quickly. And so very quickly thereafter, we start seeing these forms adapted into this new area that were very reminiscent of existing forms, but were utilizing the boundaries and confines that that particular medium had and trying to make the best of them. So things like pyramid schemes or chain letters. You may not know this, because I didn't know this when I first learned about it, was that people used to mail chain letters. There was networks of people who did that. Some of you in the audience may have participated in that and are laughing at me for being so foolishly young. But so what seemed like a new tradition was really kind of the same thing, but in a new form. And again, so that goes back to one of those triggers for what is something, how do we define something as being folklore? Repetition and variation. So I don't see the same exact things that we were seeing on the Xerox machine and the fax machine, but kind of a continuation of that in a lot of ways. So we see a lot of shorthand words that are meant to replicate face-to-face dynamics. I mean, there's no need for LOL if you're not trying to replicate what it means to laugh. But you also know, from interacting online, that sometimes little cues like emojis or emoticons or lol or something like that can help give a sense of inflection of what you intend. If you write to somebody, "I'm going to kill you," it seems very different than if you write, "I'm going to kill you," smiley face, right? And you know that because the smiley face is supposed to be like, "I'm going to kill you," versus "I'm going to kill you." Like, there's a very difference. So like even these very simple linguistic things that we've picked up on ourselves in face-to-face interactions, what I was seeing was people trying to replicate that online. And that's not to say that those practices online are inauthentic or anything like that, but that process of adaptation and adaptation, I think, was particularly interesting because there were limitations. And I can understand some of the skepticism about the authenticity of the internet as a means for capturing true folklore, especially if you look at the demographic information of who was using the internet, particularly in the early days, largely geared towards white, educated males, and not until much later, particularly when cell phones started to develop, were more diverse populations being able to access the internet. So we have the Web 1.0 era, but there's also some other things that were happening, again, this is all stuff that was happening before folklore and the internet came out, which is, again, this is sort of kind of the things that I was seeing and was making these connections and was perplexed in particular about why some of my other more established peers in folklore had not seen things this way. Well, a couple examples really stood out to me, certainly was the events of September 11th and the events of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And if you didn't follow that as closely as we did in the States, it was basically just a tremendously devastating hurricane that really wiped out large portions of New Orleans, a vibrant city in the South. But one of the things that was really upsetting for a lot of people was a perception of government inaction or lack of urgency in dealing with the situation there. And so what people were doing was they were taking this online medium and the ability to spread information quickly and realizing that you could make political commentary or social commentary about things, about very difficult subject matters even, in ways that, again, engage through humor. So one of these prime examples came through Photoshop humor. And so on the left here was an example of a Photoshop image that was circulating in the months shortly after September 11th. And if you're not quite following exactly that, that's supposed to be a middle finger, in case you're not following that. I've had students stare at that and like, I don't get it. I'm like, and then I go, oh, middle finger. Oh, okay, I get it. So that's a Photoshopped image of, because there was all this talk about, oh, we got to rebuild those towers. What are they going to look like? How are we going to show the terrorists that they can't win? You know, through architecture. And it's part of the reason why the ultimate One World Trade Center that actually did come about and has been constructed took so long to actually be produced, because there was all this fighting about memory and what it means and how we can symbolically imbue all these different sort of American values into what this is supposed to be. And then over here, I think this is a little bit more simple. This is an image in the background of downtown New Orleans, and George W. Bush and his father fishing down Canal Street rather than actually helping people. One of the things that I remember famously happening was President George W. Bush was on vacation when Katrina happened, and had the foresight to not leave his vacation early while this was all unfolding, which is one of the things that made him seem particularly insensitive at the time. So again, all this stuff is happening before 2009, before Folklore on the internet. And this is all, if you follow the IU logic, not authentic, not real. And again, if you're going from a purist oral communication face-to-face has to be there for you, I can understand the resistance, but this is, if you look at the Photoshopped images that came out, you see clear evidence of repetition and variation. And I think I'll show you what I think is one of the Photoshopped images that really showed the possibilities of digital folklore and really started the trend of Photoshop humor, particularly for deceptive or trolling purposes. And when I say trolling, I don't necessarily mean always antagonistic, but taking joy in making people confused and believing things. So the image that I want to show you is one of the most famous from shortly after September 11th. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this one. This image has been known, this guy has been known affectionately over the years as Tourist Guy. And the funny thing is I remember in high school with my beautiful little Hotmail email address, I remember getting an email that I'm about to tell you about, because I got it in October 2001. So a couple weeks, 2-3 weeks after September 11th, there was an email that was circulating online saying that somebody had found an undeveloped disposable camera at Ground Zero, and that they developed it, and oh my God, there's this amazing image of somebody on top of the World Trade Center right before the plane goes into the building. And as if to prove that it's a little bit more authentic, this lovely tradition, again that word, that tradition that was happening with a lot of photo taking at that particular time was this timestamp. If you have any friends or took a lot of pictures from that time period, you probably have seen this show up in the bottom right-hand corner of a lot of pictures, something that was common there. Again, authenticity. But this was a hoax, because people quickly realized, oh, how come the guy taking the photograph didn't notice the giant plane coming directly at them? How come the plane's not blurry? How come the guy didn't hear the giant plane behind him? Never mind, like, it's kind of, oh yeah, people also went back and figured out what the weather was in New York City, and like, that doesn't make sense for that overcast to be there. So all this internet sleuthing went down. And they very quickly realized that this was a Hungarian tourist who actually did take a picture on top of the World Trade Center. This is an actual picture of him on top of the World Trade Center. There just was no plane there. But what happened was that he and his friends had just photoshopped it, as you've heard this story a billion times with other stuff, is they just shared it amongst themselves as kind of a joke. Like, wouldn't that have been crazy if I had been there when that actually had happened? Well, then the email went out that went out and circulated this story and this narrative. And again, that narrative is very much a part of what's interesting about this, is because if you study legends or if you study narratives, which is one of my specializations, is one of the things that gets wrapped up in stories and storytelling, particularly with urban legends or contemporary legends, is this idea of believability, of plausibility. The idea that it can seem real is enough to motivate people to want to share it, or to believe it, or to feel the need to believe it. In this particular case, this sparked a backlash because people were promoting a false narrative. But interestingly enough, I think that's where you get into what became a trend, which was, and why this guy became known as Tourist Guy, is people started making their own versions of the Tourist Guy photo. That was, again, a great example of repetition and variation. And then they started showing up at different points in history when other disasters were happening. This is the date of the Hindenburg disaster, for example. And then there was another one where he's at the Kennedy assassination on the Grassy Knoll. This one is kind of a layered meta joke that was going on around September 11th. One of these self-effacing New Yorker jokes that was going on oftentimes around there was, where was King Kong when we needed him? And again, that's another example of a joke that requires knowledge of film and television and pop culture to be able to fully appreciate it. Because if you know the story of King Kong or the film King Kong, what happens? He climbs up the Empire State Building and swats a plane away as it goes around. So the idea of him being there at the World Trade Center would have been quite useful at the time. So this is, again, this would have been, if this had been a court case, this would have been my exhibit A for why digital folklore exists, and it existed before 2000. What we just have seen is that people have adapted with the technology that's around them and have found what works best and what doesn't work as effectively, and have honed that craft through this digital medium. And so legitimizing that became a goal of mine, because I knew, as one person in this, who was immersed in this, that one person can't chronicle digital culture. I can't begin to come up here and try to claim that I'm the expert on all things digital. And the reason for that is because there's so much of it. There's so much content, and it's happening, and it's generated so fast by so many different people. We can't always tell the context from where these things come from, or what they all mean, or how they fit into everything. And we can't always neatly configure those things. And that's frustrating as a researcher, where a lot of your goal is supposed to be explaining things and giving definitive answers. But a lot of work in folklore is interpretive. And trusting your interpretation and trusting your inclinations, I think, is something that's important to hear. Especially you graduate students out there. When you encounter resistance about something that you feel is interesting, that you feel is important, if you're able to build the case in a way that makes those connections apparent, you are on solid ground. I found a lot of people when I was in graduate school would be like, well, how are you publishing so much? Because I was very active even in graduate school, and I've tried to remain active. And one of the things I realized was just do it. Just start writing. Just start producing content. If you don't feel comfortable as a writer yet, one of the best ways you can start getting comfortable about that is become a book reviewer for a journal. Take on books, read how other people have written scholarship about subjects you're interested in, and then find ways to critique it, find out what they did well and what they didn't do well. It gives you an opportunity to get published, because you get to publish a book review. You get a free book out of it, which is always great in grad school. And also it helps you with your writing process, which I think is really, really important, because if you care about something and want to talk about it, you need to be ready to tell everybody who will listen. And you might encounter people who don't want to listen yet, but you got to find ways to try to be like, here's why it's important. And if you can't, start editing a book. Come up with a new call for paper and start talking to people who are established. And don't be afraid to be critical of your own writing and your own growth process, because I wouldn't call myself the world's strongest writer, but I greatly improved exponentially in my grad school years because I was writing the most that I had ever at any point. And some of it was garbage, some of it was good, and some of it went on to be published, but I was just immersed in it. And so if you're passionate about your subject matter, don't feel deterred by whatever historical, institutional rules about what is okay to study and what is not okay to study hold you back from finding what your contribution is. Because you can, because look at my case. In 2009, this book came out that is going on to be helpful in getting other people to talk about this subject matter. And I was just one motivated graduate student who happened to be there right at the right time to be able to be like, no, we really need to pay attention to this. And there were enough people to support me to make that case. And after Folklore on the Internet came out, it was great because then people were like, oh no, Trevor Blank, he's all right, he's legit, because he's done that one thing at least. And that helped open doors. So sometimes all you need is just that one success to have the confidence in yourself to really keep proceeding. And that's something that, whenever I have a chance to talk to graduate students in particular, I think is really important, especially because I was very seriously discouraged at an early point where I could have had a choice and been like, well, I don't need this, I'm out. Which was certainly a temptation at the time. But there was the fighter in me who was like, no, that's not right. I have to be there. And stuck with it. And so if you find yourself in a similar situation, don't feel discouraged. Keep pressing on. And talk to people who will tell you that you're okay for following this stuff. Because those are the people that I still talk to and still consider friends, because it's not to say that those other people were bad or enemies or anything like that. It's just there's something so powerful in believing in yourself and believing in what you do that oftentimes it can be obfuscated by the whole process of being in school. And this isn't just a grad school thing too, this is also for professionals as well, is we kind of get in our own bubbles sometimes and have trouble challenging the status quo. It's scary, it's uncomfortable, you get called strange things, and lots of assumptions are sometimes made about you. But if you believe in the work will deliver you at some point or another. At least that's what I found in my own experience. And the funny thing is I made note cards for myself to talk, and the reason wasn't because of a lack of preparation, it's because I'm doing exactly what I feared I would do, which is I will talk at length about these different kinds of threads that all tie together because they're all interconnected. That I have like a whole bunch of stuff I wanted to talk about, and I'm realizing I'm starting to run out of time. So I'm going to keep pushing forward here to try to talk about a few more things here. Another great example of repetition and variation, if you want to look at an example of Xerox lore making its way to digital culture while I sip some water here. Another great example of repetition and variation of the movement of Xerox lore to digital culture. That example is from the early 1980s, that example is from the late 1980s, and this example was collected, I think, in 2012. They're all basically the same thing. This is repetition and variation. This is all essentially the same stuff, but it's packaged differently, different context, different situations, using the technology differently. But even all these years later, the same message is finding its way into digital culture, which in and of itself has kind of its own cultural rules and things like that. And this kind of talks about what I was mentioning here in a moment. But even repetition and variation in the messages that are being embedded. And this is another great example of how pop culture can be incorporated into folklore. If you know this and follow this, you are a consumer of popular culture in a way that is adequate for you to be in on the joke. The Dos Equis man. Where you have to always know, you have to know the formula. I don't always X, but when I do Y. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of different examples of this particular joke building off of that. But even when it's not the exact form, we see echoes of that same kind of expressive patterns, the same message, the same intent going on, embedded in it. And it's our job to kind of extract that and show how it's part of this tradition, part of this lineage, and why that's significant. Okay, I'm really gonna have to blow through these because I still got a few slides to go, but I wanted to give you some more contemporary examples that weren't before Folklore on the Internet, just to kind of illustrate this point of photoshopping humor and how it kind of took place. This image, if you're not familiar with it, was taken during the raid on Osama bin Laden in May 2011, where he was killed. And this at the time became the fastest and most downloaded image in internet history, according to Flickr at the time. Remember Flickr? And so many people had downloaded this official White House image. It was like everywhere. And so what I found interesting and started collecting was tons of examples of people making their own modified versions of this that, again, pull directly on things that were going on in the news or pop culture at the time in order for it to make sense. And so the funny thing is now I have to kind of explain to you those contexts, or some of this won't make sense. So for example, there was a very popular show, I think it was aired in Canada as well. Remember Jersey Shore, anybody? It was a lovely show about some sex-crazed teens hanging out in New Jersey, another one of those places in America that has kind of a West Virginia sort of diminutive thoughts about it in some cases. But one of the people who was perhaps the most prolific at engaging in sexual encounters was a guy known as The Situation. And of course, well, you can't have a Situation Room without The Situation. So he of course belongs in there. But other stuff was going on in the news. Other people were making their own versions of that. The royal wedding, way back then, between William and Kate was going on. And something that people noticed was that all these funny hats were being worn by all these people. All these strange hats were being worn by everyone. Isn't that funny and weird? And so you saw Photoshopped images of, you know, that very same hat showing up on these people's heads. Again, taking a very serious picture, a very serious image, and reframing it, recontextualizing it. Again, something very serious, the execution of somebody who was responsible for a very traumatic wound in the American psyche. And again, playing with it. And again, even though it's play, it doesn't mean that it's not serious and doesn't tell us something. Because again, I remember the coverage about those hats, and as an American, you know, it was one of the favorite American pastimes is making fun of the British, of course, because I think there's still some of that historical angst still maybe deeply embedded. So any opportunity to kind of tease the imperial oppressors goes for it. But then other people should realize, like, well, Obama's face is kind of intense. What if everybody in the room had his kind of intense look on his face? And then other people realize just kind of like, this is just a ridiculous pop culture hodgepodge. And this is another example I collected with literally like just people randomly thinking about all the stuff that they could possibly throw in there to make their point. Oh, and then other image macros that were circulating shortly after the raid with bin Laden. Something that was covered a great deal in American news was this idea that President Obama was not actually an American, that he was a secret Kenyan, and where was his birth certificate? In fact, this is in some ways part of what helped Donald Trump come to the fore, because he was one of the most prominent backers of this birther movement and whatnot. But I love this particularly canny image on the left, because I remember seeing that one only a couple days after the bin Laden raid, and playing off the Obama swagger, the sunglasses, the pointing, trying to kind of play off of that, I thought was kind of an interesting thing. So, and then this is one other example I collected in 2009, after the Tiger Woods scandal broke, after his affair came out. And that news story kind of trickled in, and I found this to be interesting. I don't know if it's a tradition in Canada as popular as it is in America, and it's not as popular as it used to be, but the tradition of sending holiday cards, particularly around Christmases, to people that usually has a picture of the family, and then sometimes a letter about what we've been up to for the last year. Well, this came out, that story with Tiger Woods broke in November, and by Thanksgiving I had received this in my email inbox. Which I thought was interesting because it was, again, playing off of the news that was going on at the time, but it was also bringing up right around the same appropriate time of year that would be happening, this holiday tradition in and of itself of sharing a greeting card. So the title of the email, I forgot to change that to white font, sorry, says Happy Holidays from the Woods family. That was the title of the email. So you literally open it up expecting it to be a card, and that's the image that you're greeted with. And gosh, I'm really running out of time. So this is, I think, kind of self-explanatory if you follow that at all. The Bill Cosby story, certainly something that followed a lot of people follow closely in America. And again, in this particular case, we see, again, the incorporation of pop culture, incorporation of history, but also reappropriating some of the historical power that Bill Cosby enjoyed, and kind of turning on it. We see this a lot of the time in cases of scandals, or in particular when celebrities have done something that we feel has been a violation of what we perceive them to be. And as Clint Huxtable, as the American dad, Bill Cosby was like this revered figure in comedy and acting, and it's not an understatement to also mention the fact that being a black male and having such a very positive perception in America, in a place that, to put it lightly, has had some significant issues with dealing with racial issues, made this scandal all the more difficult for people to process. But again, we're talking about people being drugged and sexually abused. Again, not very good subject matters for around the dinner table. And again, humor was a way to, again, approach these subject matters and talk about a media figure and incorporate the way the media has utilized him and the way that he has made himself famous against him, and weaponized it against it. And again, using things, classic folklore, wordplay, the image macro tradition that had become established that has echoes again from Xerox lore and things like that. But again, in order for all these things to make full sense to you, you have to know not only who Bill Cosby is, you need to know what he's been accused of, and what some of those details are. So for example, one of the things that was revealed throughout the course of the investigation and becoming out in the news was that he was drugging women by getting them to drink different things, and they would be laced with Quaaludes, and these Quaaludes would render them either unconscious or incapacitated in some kind of a way. So taking the first step is literally, you don't know that unless you know the news stories. You don't know what exactly went on until you hear more of the details, and then of course just incorporation. I mean, one of the things he's most known for was being a spokesman for Jell-O in the 1980s and 90s, and all that kind of good stuff. So, oh gosh, I am really running out of time here, but these are just some of the things that Folklore has been up to since 2009, since Folklore on the internet, and has fortunately been developing into a nice, robust subgenre. I would say there's probably about 24 folklores I can think of off the top of my head that do work in digital culture stuff now in one form or another. Not all of them do it as their primary specialization, but there's a lot more folklorists involved in it. If you look at programs from recent American Folklore Society meetings and things like that, you start seeing a lot more panels and things like that talking about this. There's been a special issue of the Journal of American Folklore in 2015 dedicated specifically to these issues. And now every once in a while you see digital culture sort of folklore articles popping up in Western Folklore and Journal of American Folklore and things like that. And it's not greeted with any kind of fanfare. It's just like, here's some new folklore research, the way it should be, I felt. It has and should have been. So that's something that's been going on. Some other things that you might be interested in and might not know too much about, there's the Digital Folklore Project. It's something that's housed at Utah State University. And basically what the Digital Folklore Project does is every year gather the most influential memes and other forms of digital culture that have made an impact in a particular year. They assemble a panel of scholars and academics to review those and then make recommendations on awarding the most influential for different reasons, and we have like a scale and things like that. I've been on their selection panel since 2014, and they are occasionally looking for new people to join in because not everybody can do it every year. But it's very academically broken down. Every meme is scrutinized, its impact, its reach, some of the statistics on when it diffused and Google searches, all that kind of stuff is incorporated. And those reports are made available annually as well, so even if you're not involved in the selection process, you can find out what some folklorists have been specializing in saying these are some things we need to pay attention to. The Library of Congress at the United States Library of Congress Archive of, I should say web culture, I forgot the B there, web culture, is an ongoing archive of internet websites and other databases and cultural venues that promote and host folklore. It's a constantly changing archive, but it includes things like Urban Dictionary, which is a great example of like folk lexicon and slang and done from a wiki kind of perspective where user-created content is what generates most of what's going on there. Folklorists have been much more involved in consulting on film, television, radio, podcasts, newspapers, and fortunately not just at Halloween when we're called the most, probably. People love talking to a folklorist around a holiday for some reason, especially Halloween. I seem to get the most calls around then. But again, it goes back to people thinking folklore is this narrow thing rather than this thing that we all have and share and have a stake in. There's academic Twitter, and within that, there's something called Folklore Thursdays. If you are among the Twitter population and enjoy utilizing that, basically every Thursday, a group of folklore scholars, it actually originated in the UK, and Americans kind of have their own version of it that doesn't always follow the Folklore Society's prescriptions on Folklore Thursday. But generally what happens is a particular topic is discussed or chosen, and then people talk about it on Twitter. Either it's a reading or a concept or something going on in the field, or sometimes it's just trying to engage with the public. Like, here are perceptions that you have about folklore. Let's tell you more about what we actually do. Or pointing people to other things that are more actually representative of what a folklorist does. Promotion of open access publications. Open access publications being ones that don't have a paywall or don't require payment or subscription in order for you to be able to access that material. And again, going back to what I was saying to you graduate students who are thinking about publishing, New Directions in Folklore is a journal that I started back up in 2010. It was around in the late 1990s till about 2003. It was online only and then went dormant for a number of years. In 2010, I partnered with Indiana University Libraries to make a digital version of it, open access available. And I edited it for 4 years and then passed it on to some other folks who are continuing to run it. And one of the things that I always did when I was the editor, and one of the things that we really instilled, I'm still on the editorial board there, and one of the things that's been really instilled in that journal is encouraging graduate student submissions and work, whether it's book reviews or their own scholarship. We've tried to provide a place where students can feel not only welcome to submit their stuff, but will get one-on-one attention about editing and writing in ways that you might not get from larger publications who don't have the time necessarily to be able to dedicate that to you. There's also Children's Folklore Review, which has recently kind of become an open access publication. And just to kind of, I know I'm just about out of time, and I want to give you all an opportunity to ask me questions. And other work that's been going on recently has been a lot of great work on Creepypasta. And you probably have heard of this in some way, but if you're not familiar with Creepypasta are basically short horror stories shared online. The name Creepypasta comes from the internet shorthand copy and paste, copypasta, as it was originally called, but Creepypasta is basically creepy copypasta. The whole point of a lot of Creepypasta, these short horror stories, is to cut and paste them and share them with new people and things like that. But the part that has interested me as a folklorist has been how people put their own spins on it, where they'll take this cut and paste stuff and then add something to it or change components to it, make their own story. And perhaps one of the most interesting and influential examples of that in recent memory is the Slender Man Story. Something that started very clearly in 2009 as part of a competition to try to create an image that looked real but wasn't. That eventually took on a life of its own, where a whole collaborative network of people who were invested and interested in this particular story called and cultivated what they called the Slenderman Mythos, which is the underlying story that the Slender Man character kind of comes from. And there's different versions of that, and it's certainly taken on a different tone ever since there have been people in the United States who have been stabbed in the name of Slender Man. That has certainly changed that. And one of the other areas that a lot of folklorists are doing work in now is this concept that's relatively new that we call the Folklore Risk. And the concept of the Folklore Risk is basically pop culture's emic perception of folklore, what pop culture thinks folklore is. It's been something that a lot of us have been starting to get involved with and studying and trying to problematize to figure out ways that that's sometimes being used to manipulate and influence culture in ways that maybe they weren't originally intended to do. And I think I'm just about out of time.
Yeah, I think we're
okay.
I'm nervous we're going to lose the room. I think
Sure.
Leave it there.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you very much. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you.
If there are questions, maybe Trevor will stick around in the hall. We can have
Sure.
an informal chat. Thank you all for coming very much.